All right, everyone. Good morning again. Thank you for being here for the second installment of our System Performance Measures webinar presentation. And I just wanted to let you guys know, if you are not yet oriented to your GoToWebinar control panel, in the right-hand side, there are a number of gray headers that have a drop-down capability, and one of those is a bar that says questions, okay? And you can see below that, if you click that little arrow, it'll start pointing down and give you a space to ask a question, and you can see there's a space called, I think it says type here or put question here, where you can click into the box and you can use your keyboard to ask any questions you have as we go along. Please feel free to use that. There is going to be a part of the conversation briefly where I at least want to crowdsource a little bit of information from you, so I'm going to ask you to participate using that question panel just to give me some feedback to enhance our presentation at approximately the midpoint of our conversation today. But first, I want to thank Allison and the CAS committee for inviting me to give this presentation. I know that system performance measures is something that many of you are familiar with already conceptually, if not more in-depth. Today, we are doing the second installment. So last time we did a basic overview of system performance measures, and we did a little bit of our first point that we're trying to emphasize today. But the two things that I'm tasked with trying to discuss with you today are how system performance measures are relevant to both funded and non-funded CoC agencies. So agencies that receive CoC funding, as well as those who don't receive CoC funding but are still in our HMIS or Homeless Management Information System data, or maybe they're not in our Homeless Management Information System data, but how does our system performance measure outcome relate to agencies, whether they are CoC funded or not? And then the second question is, how can the Morris County CoC use system performance measures to end homelessness? So how can we actually harness this data and make measured improvement? Okay, so those are our two tasks. Those of you who are on the first installment of our webinar, you may be cringing because you can see that this is approximately the same presentation information that you see in front of you that we talked about last time. The reason for that is you can see this field here when we're talking about the system performance metrics. This is again from that system performance measure introductory guide that I had mentioned was a good template for understanding these measures in our last presentation. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about CoC funded and non-CoC funded entities pulling into our system performance measures. We're talking about the universe that the data is pulling from, or the total data set. So right here in measure 1, the first of our 7 metrics, you can see that the client universe for metric 1 is all persons who are in emergency shelter and safe haven project types during the reporting period. So if we're talking about the average and median lengths of time that people are experiencing homelessness, we're talking about anyone in emergency shelter or safe haven projects. And notice that there's nothing about funding source. It does not matter whether you're CoC funded or not CoC funded. This is all persons in emergency shelter and safe haven for this average and medium length of stay. And then in this case, it's all persons in emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional project types that are, whether they're CoC funded or not. Now, again, the one caveat that we need to remember all together is that this is those programs that are in our HMIS, our Homeless Management Information System. We, when we run a system performance measure report, we are only running it for the data that we have that's included in our system. So in the HMIS, that's just those HMIS entering projects that are going to pull in. But it doesn't matter whether they're receiving CoC funding for this metric, for measure 1, length of time persons remain homeless. Okay, so you can see that this measure is broken down between the two. One includes transitional housing over here, metric 1.2, and one does not include transitional housing over here. That's the only difference. All right, so that's measure 1. All right. If that doesn't illustrate it, this is a theme that we'll find throughout the system performance measures. But whether you are receiving CoC funding or you are not receiving CoC funding, your data has a very substantial contribution and impact potentially on the CoC's system performance report and whether or not the CoC looks like it's doing well. Okay. Measure 2, extent to which persons who exit homelessness to permanent housing return to homelessness. So we went over this last time, that this means that these are folks who at one time in the past 48 months, so the past 24 months, the past 2 years, had come into homelessness, and then they had a permanent housing destination. Okay, they had already been discharged from homelessness into a permanent housing location, but then they returned to homelessness within 6 to 12 months. Okay, so this is measure 2A. Measure 2B goes up to returning in up to 24 months. Okay, however, the important thing for what we're discussing here is that you can see the client universe in terms of who is impacting this measure, who's in our data set, who's in our HMIS, is that the universe for measuring returns to homelessness includes any person who is in street outreach, emergency shelter, safe haven, transitional, and permanent housing project types who exited to permanent housing destinations during the previous reporting period. So that means that it doesn't matter if you're CoC funded, it just makes the same impact whether you're CoC funded or non-CoC funded. So for instance, in street outreach, we have one CoC funded street outreach program called Step Off the Street, so that program is included in this metric, but also the Path Street Outreach program is included in this metric. So if someone who had left safe haven in the previous year and been housed comes back to the street and is engaged by a path worker on street outreach, that's going to be a return to homelessness that's going to be included, even though our street outreach program in that case is not CoC funded. It's part of our CoC's HMIS, as is the Safe Haven program, and it's going to show that as a return to homelessness. All right, I have a question here that says, why should non-CoC funded organizations enter into HMIS to be included in the CoC data sets? What incentives are there? So that's a really good question. In terms of the example that I just mentioned, in terms of the street outreach program and the PATH team, that is one of those examples where they are required by another funding source, which would be the SAMHSA PATH funding that they receive to enter into HMIS. It's a requirement there. But for anyone else, in terms of why we are asking non-CoC funded providers to participate in the HMIS, there's a couple of different incentives. Most of the incentive is that it means the CoC and the agency can run effective reporting on who they're serving. A lot of agencies have found that even though HMIS in some cases collects more data than they would be required to otherwise, that they can use that effectively in the reporting, capabilities that it has in order to make the case to funders about how many people they're serving and what impact they're having with their program. Now you could do that with other software and other data sets as well. So really the biggest piece, depending on what locality you're talking about, many CoCs are also in New Jersey anyway, centered around county governments, as you are in Morris County CoC. And so what happens there is there are sometimes local funding sources that are controlled by county freeholders or other departments within county government that in some cases make that requirement as well to participate in the HMIS, because the CoC and the counties know that there are very big benefits to actually knowing everyone who's coming in and out of our system. And so the bigger piece, aside from really agency incentives, the biggest incentive really to having your data included in HMIS, if you're not an HMIS required agency because you may not have CoC funding, is because if you are not participating in the HMIS, we don't actually have accurate information on the interplay between who's participating in your program and the other programs within the CoC. It could cause duplication of services. It could mean that there are folks that are being served who are actually returning to homelessness that it doesn't seem at initial intake that they are returning to homelessness, but they really are, because we for some reason didn't have that information about their stay in a non-HMIS participating program previously. So there's there's that system planning incentive is probably one of the highest arching reasons to want to include folks who are non-CoC funded. All right, so you can see this is the measure 2A, extent to which people are returning to homelessness. Again, doesn't matter if you're CoC funded or not. And the same thing here with 2B. Again, the only thing that has changed is that we're looking at returns to homelessness within 2 years instead of just within 6 to 12 months. Okay, it's the same universe. All persons who are in street outreach, emergency shelter, safe haven, transitional housing, or any permanent housing project type. So that could be other permanent housing, it could be permanent supportive housing, it could be rapid rehousing. If you fall into homelessness or any of those homeless required programs, it's going to show as a return to homelessness if you had been previously discharged to a permanent housing destination. All right. So again, no distinction right now in these first two measures between CoC funded and non-CoC funded folks. Okay, and the same thing is true for measure 3, number of homeless persons. So those of you who helped us participate in the point in time count, you know that we included folks who are sheltered in programs that are in HMIS. We pulled that data directly from the data system. And for those who are not in HMIS, we had surveys completed, but we counted them just the same in the point in time count. So that would be the change in the number of sheltered or unsheltered persons for metric 3.1, and then metric 3.2, change in annual counts of sheltered homeless persons. This is just sheltered, and again, we're talking about those in emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional housing. Doesn't matter if you're CoC funded or not. So first 3 metrics, no distinction between CoC and non-CoC funded agencies. Everybody that's in our HMIS, and in the case of that last metric, even not in HMIS for point in time count, they have a big impact. This is the one measure where there's a big distinction between CoC funded and non-CoC funded programming. And here's how it works. Measure 4, employment and income growth for homeless persons in CoC program funded projects. So you can even see in the title of HUD's guidance for metric 4 that it's making this distinction very clear. That what this program universe is actually talking about is, first of all, not everybody, but adults, right? So people of working age, and that's a key piece. And it's adults who are in CoC program funded safe haven, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, or permanent supportive housing project types. Okay, so it's all about CoC funded projects that are providing either safe haven, so a shelter type of safe haven program, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, or permanent supportive housing. And it's not just all adults, but it's all adults who have been in HMIS for at least a year and are still in the system at the end of the reporting period. Okay, so that means that this is for persons who they came into the program or in the project, and HUD's not expecting that within 20 days everybody's got a huge jump in income necessarily. Okay, so they're not measuring short-term stayers in this particular metric in terms of who's increasing or gaining income while they're in the project. Instead, it's those who have been in the HMIS system overall for at least a year and are still in the system at the end of the reporting period. So someone came into the program and had been at least 12 months, for instance, a permanent supportive housing program. Many of the participants have been there at least for 1 year because it is permanent housing. And there is a requirement that there's an annual update of income completed in the HMIS by the providers. So this is the type of client that might be pulling in. But again, it's just for CoC program funded projects. Okay, so it's a much narrower universe than all of the general numbers that we were talking about. Okay, so I'm being told on the question line that you're getting some static. Does anybody else have that problem? Is my sound suffering? It's intermittent. Weird. That's lame. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to press on, but if in the next 2 to 3 minutes you have another episode of static, please light up my question bar and I will call in from another line and do the same thing I had to do in calling an audible the last time. in presentation. Okay, so I apologize for the technical glitch. I hope everybody can hear. All right. All right, so the next metric, okay, on this side, this was metrics 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3. You can see it's change in employment income, okay, so earnings from jobs, change in non-employment income, okay, so that would be any income from SSI or other entitlement benefits or Social Security benefits that folks may be able to participate in, and then change in total cash income. So that's the combination of these two things, just overall income during the reporting period. And it's the same over here, the same three breakdowns. So employment, non-employment, and total. But in this case, okay, this is for not just adults in CoC funded projects, but it's specifically for leavers. It's for folks who then exit whatever projects they've been in and leave the HMIS during the reporting period. So the hope would be that the majority of these folks who are exiting would be folks who, for instance, left a permanent housing program and they stayed permanently housed, or they left transitional housing and leased up in an apartment on their own. And so we are hopeful that over the course of their stay, that means that the reason that they were able to move on to a permanent housing location is because they increased their income. So at exit, you would be doing an exit interview, and part of that exit interview for our HMIS participating partners, is what was their income at exit. Okay, so, and what were the sources of that income? So did they get connected to anything during their stay with you while you were working with them that they didn't have previously? Okay, so this metric number 4, is really the biggest one in terms of having a differentiation between CoC program funded projects and non-CoC funded projects. So if you are a non-CoC funded project, your impact on this income growth for homeless persons in these projects is tangential. It's to the side. It's not necessarily coming directly from your data, but you could imagine that all of the partners in our CAS or in our community CoC have an impact. Even if you are talking about, for instance, maybe the biggest impact would be our partner at Office of Temporary Assistance, or OTA. If you think about just the impact of that agency, even though they are not a CoC funded agency and they don't necessarily have any adults in these project types in HMIS, the impact that that office has on all of our programs that do meet this definition in terms of connecting folks to non-employment cash income could be just incredibly huge. I mean, they are the major source of connecting folks to non-employment cash income in the CoC. So just because you're a non-HMIS or non-CoC funded, I should say, program doesn't mean that you don't have an impact on this metric. It just means that it's not coming directly from your CoC, your program data in HMIS, because it's just these programs that are CoC funded. Okay, so keep that one in mind for metric 4. Okay, we're going to move on to metric 5, number of persons who become homeless for the first time. Now, this one is, again, going back to having an inclusion for every single type of project, whether you're CoC funded or not. And this is looking at persons who entered any of the emergency shelter, safe haven, or transitional housing projects during the reporting period for the first time. They had never prior had an enrollment in HMIS, so they were never before seen in the HMIS in Morris CoC. Okay, and I just got a notification here that it's good for me to try to call in from another line. So I apologize for the static that you're hearing, and I am going to call in from another line. So I will be right back. Okay. All right, folks, I believe that I am back. Can someone light up my question box and make sure that you can hear me? Better. I got high. I got better. I hope everyone can hear me. I am back. We're going on to measure 5.2. All right, so you can see that the major difference here between 5.1, which is all persons in emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional, and 5.2 is that 5.2 includes permanent housing project types. So that would include rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing. And so there are some cases where, for instance, in permanent housing projects, let's say that there's a non-HMIS emergency shelter provider. So let's say you guys have, for instance, in your community, JBWS. So you have someone who is fleeing domestic violence, but they have a disabling condition, and they are eligible for permanent supportive housing, and they're highly vulnerable. They could have never before been in HMIS. This is the first episode of homelessness they've experienced, and their first time entering HMIS would be that they entered maybe Family Promise of Morris County or some other agency's open permanent supportive housing project. So how weird is that? You have this whole HMIS system that has these homeless programs like emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional housing, but the first time this person is recognized as homeless is when they enter a permanent supportive housing project, because our domestic violence partners, our victim service providers, are not able to enter into HMIS. So our HMIS only recognizes this person as first-time homeless when they enter permanent housing. So that's one of those little weird places where non-HMIS and HMIS participation meet, is under this one for a number of persons who become homeless for the first time. And I just want to mention this again. We talked about it last time. Really, this is not a measure of the number of persons who become homeless for the first time, right? Really what this is the number of persons who are in these types of projects, emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional, with no prior enrollments in HMIS that are now in our HMIS, okay? There are plenty of persons who are experiencing homelessness for the first time that are not going to pull it when we run our system performance measure report in our CoC. And the biggest example is what we just mentioned, our victim service provider, JBWS, right? Many of the participants in their programs, I would suspect, may be experiencing homelessness for the first time. Or maybe for the first time in our CoC. But those folks are not going to be included in this metric because they're not in the HMIS. So again, keep in mind that this client universe is not perfect. It's not complete in every sense. This is just measuring based on the information we have and based on these project types that are included in our HMIS. Okay, measure 6 I get a break on because nobody is actually impacted by this measure yet. This is only for high-performing communities, and there are none of those yet. And I mentioned the last time a little bit about what it means to be a high-performing community. The very high bar in terms of having a crisis response system that can end homelessness extremely quickly and flexibly for folks as they experience homelessness. So it's a great thing to aspire to, but it is not where anybody is in the country yet. All right, so we're on to the last measure, and then we'll move on to some strategies to actually impact these system performance measures. So measure 7A, successful placements. So measure 7, all of the variations are about successful placement. And what it means by successful placement is exits or placements to permanent housing destinations, okay? And really, we're talking about how did we solve that person's homelessness while they were in this project or in our system? Did they get to a good outcome? And then, you know, maybe some folks went to temporary destinations and some went to institutional destinations. These destinations would not count as a, quote, positive or permanent housing destination. It happens, but it's obviously, in terms of performance, what we're shooting for is that we engage someone and they get to permanent housing as quickly as possible. Okay? In 7A, the nuance is that the universe for 7A is just for street outreach. Okay, so any programs, whether CoC funded or not, that are labeled as street outreach, so primarily PATH program, and in the case of Morris CoC, you have Step Off the Street, which is the CoC funded outreach. Okay, those two projects are street outreach project types, and what this measure looks at specifically is how many of the persons who were in that project type exited directly from street outreach to a permanent housing destination. Okay, so that's what it's measuring, and we'll look at that again from different locations in the next couple of metrics. But just some things to keep in mind. If you are working in a street outreach program, you're working with unsheltered individuals, in many cases, it would be perceived that to discharge someone from a street outreach program where you're working with them in an unsheltered location and discharging them to an emergency shelter, which would be potentially a temporary destination, we would hope, right? That is maybe a positive outcome in our minds in terms of the safety and stability and ability for engagement of that individual. But in terms of this particular metric, this metric is saying we're really only counting as a positive destination anyone who's discharged directly from the street to a permanent housing location. Okay, so that's the bar that is set by this metric. All right. So, okay. So, and I appreciate the clarification. Danielle just clarified that if there was a discharge from a street outreach project into, for instance, an emergency shelter bed or maybe a safe haven bed, that would be considered a linkage to that service of shelter rather than a discharge. So there would still potentially be engagement because that person would no longer be on the street, but maybe they would just be providing services instead of necessarily, the same type of street outreach. And Danielle's saying they would keep them open as in on their caseload if they were linked to shelter and still continue to work toward housing. So that makes perfect sense. The difficulty with some of these metrics is that, again, HIMIS is only measuring stuff based on how the data is entered into the programs. So in many cases, for instance, with the PATH team, they have two different projects. One is the street outreach component, okay, which is for folks who are unsheltered, and one is the supportive services component. And that supportive services component can keep people in services while they're in either tenuous housing, where they're really at risk of homelessness, or if they're in a sheltered location and they're in someone else's program, you can transfer them over to the supportive services project type. But in this case, what HUD is only measuring is the street outreach program type. So again, the reality of how our system is working is not necessarily always measured the way we think it is with regard to these system performance measures. So it makes it tricky, and that's why it's crucial when we're looking at these data to keep it in mind where it's being pulled from, because if we start panicking and saying, oh my goodness, all our street outreach discharges are going to temporary locations, well, that's just from the street outreach component, right? And then, as Danielle said, that's not necessarily when the program has discharged them. It just looks like that in HMIS because they've been moved over to the supportive services project while they're in shelter. So they're still receiving that service. So those are the types of wrinkles that these system performance measures have in this particular metric for street outreach. All right, so thank you for that context, Danielle. All right, so this is measure 7A at successful exits to permanent housing from street outreach specifically. 7B is successful placement in or retention of permanent housing. Okay, so this first metric is the persons who are in, again, doesn't matter if you're CoC funded, but any emergency shelter, safe haven, transitional housing, or rapid rehousing program, okay? And who exited during the reporting period to a permanent housing destination. So it's measuring out of the number of people who left emergency shelter, safe haven, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing, how many exit to permanent destinations, okay? And then on this side, metric 7B2, the only difference is that it's measuring all persons in PH project types except for rapid rehousing. So this would be anyone in a permanent supportive housing program or any other permanent housing programs that's not rapid rehousing that would be in our CoC in the HMIS. So this counts not just persons who are exiting as a positive destination, but if you keep your permanent supportive housing during the operating period, that's still a very positive destination because we want you to stay housed. So unless you've gone somewhere else and it's a temporary or homeless situation or institutional situation, those would still be positive outcomes if you stayed in the program or if you exited to a permanent housing destination. Again, doesn't matter if you're CoC funded. This is all persons that are in these types of projects. Okay, so those are the system performance measures, and I hope that everybody has a little bit better understanding of which programs are pulling into each measure. Again, you can absolutely feel free to ask any questions in the question bar during the rest of the program, or you can, I called it a program, it's a presentation and conversation hopefully in the next phase. But you can also take your time to look through the System Performance Measures Introductory Guide. That it is a helpful resource just to keep in mind, hey, let me look for throughout this guide where my transitional housing program that's HMIS participating shows up. And let me see how my data are impacting these measures, because it is a helpful thing for me to think about. Same thing with street outreach or safe haven or emergency shelter. Those are all critical components that are having an impact on our data as reported in the system performance measures. So keep that in mind. Now, I hope that was most of the answer or a large majority of the answer to our question for today about what the system performance measures mean for both participating or CoC funded and non-CoC funded providers. The next part of our question is, so what do we do with this? What do we do with system performance measures, and how can we actually use the information to make planning decisions? And the critical piece here is there's not a one-size-fits-all, but what I am going to do, in keeping with the ways that we've gone through this series, I'm going to go through some of the recommendations that are available. And specifically, there is a document that I'm going to go through in a moment that's called Strategies for System Performance Measure Improvement. But first, I just want to recap and ask you to participate in the question bar. And feel free to participate or not participate. But I just want to look at a couple of the measures and brainstorm with you and hear from you what you think about how knowing what these programs are that are impacting our system performance and what we have at our disposal in terms of variables to control, how we would use this information to plan to have a reduction in the length of time people spend homeless, okay, for this particular segment. So go for it. In the question bar, okay, throw me an answer. What could we do? How could we use the information about how long people are spending in emergency shelter and safe haven program or emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional housing projects? What could we do to examine, based on this information, how to reduce the average length of time people spend in these projects? What are the ways that we could use this information to have an impact? Maybe it's policy. Maybe it's funding a new program. Maybe it's changing existing programs. Maybe it's additional services to people who are already here. Maybe it's keeping people from coming into certain programs. Anything you have that you want to throw out there, feel free to just throw a suggestion out there. How could we change the length of time people spend in homelessness on average? Okay, so keep in mind, this is measuring for all persons in emergency shelter and safe haven. So it's maybe the quote unquote easiest folks who maybe have a bad night because their unit that they are moving into isn't ready and they had been evicted the day before. Those are folks that may not need a lot of information, a lot of services. Maybe they just need a hotel motel stay because they've got nowhere else to go, or they're on the street in their car with their moving stuff ready to go. and maybe they just need one or two or a very short period of interventions, but you also at the same time, because that is going to count as emergency shelter if they take a hotel motel stay, you've also got long-term stayers in safe haven that are all part of this data. So how do we reduce average length of time? Okay, so keep that in mind. Any suggestions out there? All right. So we have someone who said funding for first month's rent and security deposit. Okay, so if I'm in emergency shelter and the biggest barrier to me getting out is being able to get enough of a lump sum saved because I can only save X number of dollars a month in my income, it would help me to have a security deposit and first month's rent paid for me, because then I can get out today if I can find a willing landlord, and I can figure out how to be sustainable on the back end. That's a great one. Availability of affordable housing, okay, contributes to it a lot. So that's a suggestion. You know, if I'm in emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional housing, and there are a plentiful number of affordable housing options, or landlords that are willing to work with me is another suggestion coming in. If I'm able to have a available, affordable, and willing landlord, then yeah, of course, it's going to be easier because I'm not going to have to be hitting the pavement for months just looking for a unit I could potentially afford. So I also have one here. This is a great point. Is looking at the effectiveness of services being offered. For instance, case management, support services, ID assistance, and realtor fees. This is a huge point that, you know, there are, between the different shelters and transitional housing and safe haven, between the different programs that we have in our CoC that measure the length of time homeless, we have it's not just one agency providing it. So there could be different services available in terms of housing search, in terms of mental and behavioral health treatment, in terms of, you know, financial planning that are provided from program to program. So, are they all being effective in the same way? And is there any differentiation or update or empowerment that we could do for case managers to help them be more effective? That's a really great point. Rooms for very low income individuals. So again, super affordable housing, partnerships between agencies, including DCA and housing authorities. Really great point, right? Goes to the affordable housing piece. One way to make housing affordable is to have those entities that have mainstream housing assistance, such as Section 8, which would be the DCAs and the housing authorities of the world, to actually try to use those resources for the people who, in some perception need it most, who are literally without a home. I think that some really great points here, and you can see that this is an easy way for us to we know a lot of the variables. We know a lot of the variables that are at play. But what we don't often do is say, hey, what would it look like if we took our case managers and did X, Y, or Z differently for 90 days, right? We stepped up budgeting training or that life skill, or we stepped up the amount of financial assistance we could provide with first month's rent. We had a flexible funding source, and we said, you know what, let's see how sustainable and quickly we can get folks into permanent housing with this as an intervention for 90 days and measure whether or not it has an impact. Those are the types of things that as a system we can do, even though there's other variables at play, and it's not foolproof and it's not a 100% to 100% correlation. Those are things that we can do. Okay, and maybe we say, hey, dear housing authority, give us a set aside of your units or of your Section 8 turnover beds for the next 6 months. And we are going to help provide services to those folks, and we're going to compare these 6 months with the last 6 months to see how many persons with our hardest to serve population can get housed if we start doing that. Let's actually measure it. Let's actually see if we can, by virtue of that, if we're setting aside housing units for the people who are the chronically homeless, and we house 20 chronically homeless dudes in 6 months, guess what's going to happen to our average length of stay in homelessness? It's going to drop substantially, because that guy that was in our Safe Haven program who had been in emergency shelter or on the street prior and had been homeless for 12 plus months, he gets permanently housed. All of a sudden, you take that big number out of our average length of homelessness. And so those are the things that are really impactful. And thanks for thinking of that. Thanks for the brainstorming. I appreciate everybody participating there. Okay. Reducing returns to homelessness. I'm going to jump to the one on this side with the 2 years. Okay, so what could we do if we know that anyone who got discharged in the past 2 years, or few years, I should say, and then comes back into any of our street outreach, emergency shelter, safe haven, transitional, or permanent housing programs is going to count as a return to homelessness. Obviously, once we get someone permanently housed, it's not permanent unless they stay permanently housed, right? So the goal is obvious, but the extent to which we're successful can vary widely, and it doesn't necessarily just boil down to one factor. It doesn't always boil down to income. For instance, there are plenty of folks who are paying a large portion of their income toward housing costs, especially in a community like Morris County where the cost of living and housing is so high, but they never become homeless, right? They're impoverished. Maybe they need to increase income, but they still stay housed. Maybe the difference is a life event, like a health crisis or a job loss. A very brief loss of income can sometimes throw everything out of balance and cost people their housing. So what are some of the things that we can do to prevent people from returning to homelessness? Does anyone have any ideas? If we look at our data and we say, oh my goodness, we have more people returning to homelessness this year. Last year, when we measured this, it said that there were, say, 8% of persons who had been discharged into a permanent destination had come back in some way, shape, or form. And this year, it's 15%. What changed, and how could we change this? How could we move the needle? Any suggestions out there? Okay, so we have the suggestion of here's one. Check-ins at annual recertification for households receiving rental assistance. So for folks who are in, for instance, permanent supportive housing, how stable are you at your annual recertification? Have you increased income? Can we check on your stability in all aspects? You are required to do new housing inspections or unit inspections. You are required to do a check on income. What else are we checking? Are we checking on the progress on their individual plan, their goals, whether it's a rehabilitation plan for someone with mental illness, or whether it is a service plan for life skills? How are we checking up on that, and are we actually helping folks stay housed in permanent supportive housing? It's a great point. Okay, how about, what if we piloted a program that said, okay, every single person that exits transitional housing or emergency shelter in our CoC, let's include safe haven too. I don't want them to feel left out. All right, so transitional housing, safe haven, or emergency shelter. Let's say that everyone who exits between January of 2019, okay, so going back a few months, and June of 2019, so the first half of this year, that everyone who exits during that time period is going to have a follow-up case management meeting, regardless of where they went. We're going to reach out to them and try to, either by phone or in person, touch base with them and see where their household is at with housing situation upon discharge in another 4 months. Okay, so late fall, every single person is going to have a follow-up call We're going to see how they're doing. We're going to make sure they don't need any assistance. We're going to make sure that that housing situation they got themselves into is sustainable, and they're not all of a sudden behind on their rent and utilities again like they were when we saw them coming into our emergency shelter the first time, right? What impact would that have? We don't know. We could test it though. We could compare the data from year to year, and we could figure out whether or not that program was worth the dollars and cents spent in terms of the impact that it gives if we have better results. I have a suggestion here for a kind of a recognition after 2 years for folks who could have the option to volunteer to work with their peers or folks who are coming up behind them who have also experienced a similar life event of homelessness. So someone who has come through an emergency shelter, transitional housing, or safe haven program, they've been discharged to a permanent housing location, and we just reach out to them and see how they're doing, and they're crushing it. They're doing a great job staying housed, and are wanting to give back. Is there an opportunity for them to provide assistance, to provide a hand up to the folks coming up behind them? Are we giving folks that opportunity to give back and participate in the thing that helped them? That would be a great possibility. And would that have an impact? Do we think that we would actually have folks who are in our street outreach programs, for instance, or in our safe haven and emergency shelter programs, participating more in their own care if they are talking with someone who has done exactly what we're asking them to do, and they can see that someone was successful? That's a great question. So you guys can see that there's plenty of opportunities to just look at the measures themselves, workshop the data, see what it's saying, whether it's going the right direction or not, and then say, how could we help this? How could we improve this? I have another point here from our mental health association saying that, there's also opportunity for service-only referrals. People don't just have to be in housing. There's no specificity that as long as they are having the type of diagnosis that might want to participate in CSS, they could receive mental health treatment. So maybe are we providing that linkage while they're already in street outreach, emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional housing, or are we waiting until they're in permanent housing and maybe by then they're starting to decompensate? Can we get them to participate and assist? Oh, I'm sorry, Danielle's correcting me. No, CSS is only once, and they are housed to prevent recidivism. Okay, got it. So yeah, can we provide the needed services at the right time so that folks can actually achieve stability in housing? So what services are we connecting them with so that they are stable? And are we providing the right blend of services? So this is going to come up in the next piece that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to jump over to that document that I mentioned to you before. And I really encourage everybody to check it out. It's called Strategies for System Performance Measure Improvement. Okay. And this is, again, straight from the horse's mouth. I'm not giving you anything that I wouldn't have already tried to look at myself in order to inform me based on what is HUD thinking about this stuff. Okay, so this is, again, another document from HUD. It's called System Performance, or Strategies for System Performance Measure Improvement. And they have 3 major areas that they're hoping to see folks focus on in order to improve around these particular metrics. Okay, I'm going to scroll down. Oh, I think I went too far. I wanted to show you this first. Here we go. All right, so system performance improvement strategies. Okay, there's 3 different segments, and I'm going to scroll down so you can see them all. Okay, so number 1, from the perspective of this CoC funder, okay, which would be HUD, enhance coordinated entry. Okay, so what does that mean? We've got to make sure that we have the information necessary to prioritize, right size, incorporate diversion. Okay, so how do we prevent returns to homelessness? Maybe some people don't actually have to come into shelter. Streamline admissions and lower barriers so that time spent isn't wasted in shelter based on doing eligibility documentation and so forth, and try to streamline things. Link to effective outreach and in-reach, target prevention assistance, okay? These things don't necessarily sound like coordinated entry, but they really are exactly linked to coordinated entry, because it's all part of prioritizing and right-sizing the assistance. Based on what vulnerabilities someone is experiencing or we are assessing, whether they think they're experiencing it or not, they may be in a tough pinch. What's the right intervention based on the combination of vulnerabilities they have, right? I think a lot of the concern that folks have about rapid rehousing is, I'm going to have someone with vulnerabilities and barriers that are so high that I'm going to set them up for failure. Because they're not going to be able to get their income together. They're not going to be able to manage their disabling condition. You know, there's no affordable housing. Those are the types of things that we hear a lot in our community. Not that they are, you know, dismissible variables. Those are real issues. But how do we know that the intervention that we're utilizing is right for that individual household? You know, we need to be able to point to the performance of households that look like this household, and the factors that those other households were impacted by, and see whether these practices have good impact. Okay, incorporating diversion. This is something that I know we already have in some degree on the coordinated entry with 211 and their screeners or their call specialists, and as well probably at the drop-in centers, talking to folks who are in crisis. But do you have to come to the emergency shelter or go to OTA? Is there nowhere else or no one else that can assist? And how do we do that? And does that have an impact? Can we measure trying different diversion strategies? And we're only going to be able to do that if we have a coordinated entry. Because if the person calls and talks to one agency and then calls and talks to another agency and calls and talks to another agency, it's definitely not coordinated entry, and the chances of diverting someone when we don't have a unified front as a system is very low, because someone's going to break through with a case manager or an open bed somewhere potentially, you know, and they may not need it. All right, streamline admissions and lower barriers. If we're spending months and months getting someone's documentation together, or if we're spending, you know, a ton of time trying to beg a provider to take someone with a criminal background, or if we're spending our time trying to rehabilitate someone's credit score, you know, these are things that are substantial time barriers. You know, it impacts how long someone's going to be homeless. It may also impact their successful placement. I mean, if there are no programs that can serve people who have a particular criminal background, they're going to stay homeless, you know? So how do we lower barriers, and how does that have an impact? Link to effective outreach and in-reach. If we just park people in emergency shelter and there's no services provided, there's no help looking for housing, there's no help, as Danielle was mentioning, linking to mental health services or whatever they may need once they're getting ready to be housed, that's a critical miss, and that's a critical thing that they're potentially not going to have the strength to overcome when they are in housing. Okay, and link to effective. It doesn't mean everybody needs everything. Okay, and I just got a question about what is in-reach. So in-reach is really, as opposed to saying someone is on the street down by the river or in the woods and I got to go out and find them, that's real outreach. It could be that there's someone in a hotel motel placement at OTA that the OTA case manager doesn't have the time to provide in-depth case management to. They're just providing the benefit from EA for that hotel motel placement or shush placement in hotels that night. Maybe it's a code blue, you know, whatever the case may be. But there's not a service provided in depth except to say, come back to the Board of Social Services, or excuse me, to OT, Office of Temporary Assistance, tomorrow for assessment. You know, it could be that there's an opportunity to in-reach, or, you know, have someone who's actually providing engagement services with clients who are in our shelters or in various sheltered locations that our CoC offers. But there's, there's not opportunity for them to do that. So the difference between in-reach and outreach is basically that outreach would be someone who is not already potentially engaged or in a program or shelter that we are working with in the CoC. And in-reach would be actually saying, who do we already have that's being provided assistance, but is not really engaged in their own, housing plan? How do we get those folks to get on the road to recovery if that's necessary, but also to housing stability? Okay. Targeting prevention assistance. This is huge because there's so little prevention assistance, and some of it is so specifically targeted. How do we do this to have the maximum impact on reducing homelessness, reducing the number of people that come into homelessness, and then, making an impact on preventing people from returning to homelessness? Okay. Those are all under the heading coordinated entry. Okay. So just take note of that really this is a major, major tool in our toolbox in terms of impacting system performance, is using coordinated entry to impact diversion, prevention, outreach, admissions, and obviously that's all basically under the heading of prioritizing and right sizing, right? Finding the right intervention for the right client and then prioritizing those clients that need it the most. That's really coordinated entry at its most expansive. Okay, strengthen housing-focused practices. Okay, so what's meant by this is the second bullet really in this arsenal from this material that we are looking at for strategies, and housing-focused case management. Okay, so this goes pretty closely along with streamlining admissions and lowering barriers. Okay. The philosophy that's being promoted here in strengthening housing-focused strategies is, you may be in my shelter or transitional housing program, but my primary goal is to get you housed. Above anything else, I want to, as soon as you come in my door, we're talking about how you can open the door to your own place and walk out my door for the long term so that you can stay housed. And now, that may sound very, very simplistic and intuitive. The reality is that it becomes very difficult when you have clients or individuals or households that have barriers that we think we have to address first, right? And obviously, many of you are familiar with the idea of the housing first methodology, right? The housing first philosophy, right? HUD's perspective is, at least at this juncture with housing first being a focus, is the most important thing right now, if I'm talking to you in emergency shelter or transitional housing or safe haven, is that I get you unhomeless. Not that I get you sober, not that I get you out of your court date, not that I get you to be a nicer person, but instead that I get you unhomeless and housed and prepared to then stay housed, whether that takes money, whether that takes service, whether that takes budgeting, whatever it takes. Let's talk about what the skills are that you need to be housed, or the resources that you need to be housed, and let's focus there as soon as possible so that you get housed as quickly as possible. Okay. Policies and procedures to promote housing stability. Okay, this again kind of goes along with the lowering the barriers, but it also can talk about how we are, it may go along with the scale permanent housing interventions piece on reallocate resources. And let's scroll down to this one on policies and procedures. You can see that there's a breakout below this that's talking about every single one of these options. Okay. Now, this is some of the things that they're talking about here. Okay. Removing lease provisions and participation agreements that revolve around services and require involvement in services. Okay, so that's a housing first philosophy with regard to while folks are in programs or in housing projects. Okay, also building capacity to address problems such as missed rent payments or disturbances to neighbors through effective case management and motivational interviewing practices. I just the other day was in a visit for a on-site monitoring of a CoC-funded project. It's a permanent supportive housing project, and it's in New Jersey. And I was going through the service plan because one of the things that you want to see when you're looking at a permanent supportive housing project is where's the support? You know, what are people doing in this project that's different than just having someone be on their own in the world hoping that they're never going to become homeless again? And let me tell you, the service portfolio that I was looking at was a grind. It was this case manager that was doing these service notes was doing everything in their power to help the client manage their finances so that they could stay housed. They hit up the local LIHEAP project to make sure that they could pay their back utility bills. They went physically with the client to the Board of Social Services in that county and made sure they got their food stamps again, so they didn't have to use their food money, to pay their other bills, that they could actually use that benefit, reinstating their GA that they were still eligible for. But it took months just to contact the client because the client wouldn't return their calls. They would show up and the client wouldn't be there. The client got into an altercation with a neighbor. I mean, these are all types of things that if we are having a policy that the difficult client is going to need to be terminated from the voucher, that person's going to become homeless again, right? They're not going to be able to cope. They will get themselves into an untenable financial situation, and they won't ever be able to overcome those barriers that are constructed or maybe even self-constructed to achieve long-term stability in housing. It won't be possible unless there's an actual ability to promote through our policies in the programs that we're funding, that we would reduce barriers within program, not just to get at intake, but also to prevent termination. Okay, so that's policies and procedures to promote housing stability. Housing navigation, okay? This really goes under the question that was provided earlier when we were just workshopping. Well, what about the services that are being provided to clients, right? And it goes with housing-focused case management. Do we have tools to help people understand how to navigate the rental market? Or, let's scroll down and see what the exact little summary is here for this one, right? Do they have the resources to understand what's around in the neighborhood, to see what's in, what they need? Do they have a car? Do they need to walk? Do they know how to be a tenant? Do they know how to keep up with their expenses and make those rental costs make sense? Do we as a community have a good hold on what housing is available so that we can help our clients avail themselves as quickly as possible? I think these are the types of things that I know folks in the community are working on, working with landlords, investigating whether or not those dynamics are working for our consumers who may need housing. Okay. And now the last section of these solutions that are proposed here is scale permanent housing interventions. Okay. Recruit private landlords. Everybody, I think, already knows this is something that's being worked on by the Drew study, and understanding that dynamic so that we can figure out how to get folks on board with accepting those interventions that we do have available in the form of permanent housing subsidies. Okay, leverage mainstream housing and services. In Morris CoC, a lot of that looks like, hey, what is OTA doing around the table? They are a very crucial partner, right? And mainstream housing and services in our CoC, because of the laws of the state of New Jersey, include emergency assistance, right? Could be TRA, could be EA hotel motel placement. That's a critical piece. But the other point that was brought up earlier is what's a mainstream housing provider, right? Well, DCA has SRAP, has Section 8, but you also have housing authorities. You have the Morris County Housing Authority. You have the Morristown, Dover, and Madison Housing Authorities. You know, these are folks that have housing that really is not being provided as a form of subsidy to our homeless clients as frequently as we may hope, right? So those are things that we can do to try to leverage that opportunity. The more, you know, the other point that was made is we need more affordable housing. Well, again, what makes housing affordable in some cases is some of these programs like Section 8. Reallocate resources, like we're saying here. Scale the permanent housing interventions. The more housing that you have, the more you can house people, okay? But, you know, you have to do it in a way that keeps people permanently housed and hopefully is going to move them toward independence as quickly as possible so we can have someone come up behind them, take advantage of that resource again. And this is one of the big ones that is being emphasized by both the National Alliance and HUD, is build rapid rehousing capacity. Okay, the points that were made again earlier when we were workshopping this idea was, hey, what if we had security and first month's rent for people? Wouldn't that end their homelessness more quickly? Well, you can do that with rapid rehousing. As long as someone is homeless, they don't need a disabling condition necessarily. You can just provide them with rapid rehousing assistance, including security and first month's rent. That could be a game changer for a household that otherwise has to wait months and months in shelter in order to afford housing and in order to afford to move in, just because they're saving up for that security and first month's rent. All right. So these are critical pieces that, as HUD sees it, to produce better outcomes in our system. And you know, I hope that there are some useful ideas for you to consider. And I'm just going to make sure that everybody can see every single part of this this chart while it's up here. Now, this piece here is only part of the solutions. Okay, I'm not here to tell you that these are the only options that we can investigate. However, many of these are very similar or very, very related to the ideas that you guys yourselves came up with off the tops of your head when we were talking about the metrics. So it is a lot of, hey, we have the common sense to know that we can potentially do better and that there are opportunities to make a difference and move the needle on these metrics so that our consumers stay homeless for a shorter period of time, they're more successful in moving into permanent housing on average, and that they don't come back into homelessness. There's opportunity out there. We know some things will work, but we have to have the willingness, coordination, and resources to try and then measure whether these have an impact. That's critical. Otherwise, we'll just keep trying things, and if the numbers stay the same, you know, we'll just say, oh, well, that didn't work, instead of saying, well, maybe if we did this, or maybe if we did this. Not to say that we need to spin our wheels and always be chasing the silver bullet, because that will not be happening. But based on what we know has worked elsewhere, and based on what we know can be helpful in the short term to our clients, I think that, you know, it's really exciting to hear from you guys about the ideas you may have already about how we can improve linkages, how we can improve connection to benefits, what types of things we already know we need. The bigger ticket items, like actually developing enough affordable housing in the community, that is a big, big lift. Okay, and I'm not saying we take our eyes off of that prize, but there are also some maybe smaller interventions that we can use to make sure that we're prioritizing and right-sizing the assistance that we're giving based on the resources we do have, or those that are well within reach to acquire. And then test whether or not moving forward it's a good idea to use them. So I encourage you to continue to workshop in your own minds how these metrics can be used effectively for planning, and to to be used to check whether the things you guys are already doing are moving the needle, right? What would happen if we retrained all of our frontline staff to have a better understanding of what it means to be housing focused in case management, or to have a little bit more of rapid rehousing assistance in their wheelhouse, right? Those are things that you could definitely check on a period by period basis whether they have an impact on how people are moving through our system, whether or not they have better outcomes of obtaining and sustaining permanent housing, okay? It's not a straight line. It's not always easy. There are things that are not in our control, as you all know. But I encourage you to keep thinking that way and keep trying to say, hey, I have an idea of something that is going to move the needle. How can we try it, and how could we measure it with our system performance measures? You know, we know what's in our HMIS. We know what's not in our HMIS. But we also have a powerful tool that is at your disposal that your partners in the coordinated entry process are working on, which is, how is coordinated entry giving us information about who's homeless and what they need? And are we engaging in really prioritizing the people for whom, you know, just housing one person is going to reduce the average length of homelessness in our community because they've been homeless for a decade? You know, that's a huge impact. Are we right-sizing assistance? Are we giving permanent supportive housing just to the folks who are only going to be housed if we give them permanent supportive housing? You know, are we giving rapid rehousing just to the folks that are going to need rapid rehousing because we don't have enough of it to go around? There's just not enough money. So what are we doing that's going to have the biggest impact, even if we don't have enough money for everybody? So those are the things that I'm excited to hear continued conversation and strategic thinking around. So I do want to just say I'm wrapping up here. There are no questions right now in the question box, but I will volunteer, because it always comes up, that I anticipate that these resources that I went over with you, as well as hopefully the recording of this webinar, are going to be provided to you in short time by your friendly neighborhood CAS chair, Allison. And so if you have any questions about those and you want to follow up with me directly, you can feel free to do that. I hope everybody has my my contact information, but if not, you can just search me at J. Everett at Monarch Housing Associates, or you can email me. If you need that information, you can always reach out to Allison. She definitely has my email, and maybe she'll provide it in the email that she sends the materials out on, just in case someone wants to follow up as well. That might be helpful for folks. Okay, so feel free to reach out and brainstorm with me, but brainstorm with each other. Brainstorm with your friendly neighborhood CoC executive committee member. Talk to your chair. Bring up things that you want to be on agendas that are impacting the way everyone's working. It's really a crucial piece. And so I thank you guys for your attention and participation. And I really hope that you took some information away that's helpful. And when I get to talk about these types of system performance measures, it does get me reinvigorated. It makes me a little bit excited to say, hey, this is a great opportunity to try to move the needle. And instead of being just stuck in everything that we have to do every day, we can think a little bit farther ahead than tomorrow. And we can say, what would do better for the people that I'm serving? How could I house twice as many people in a few years? How could I do a great job for my consumer? How could I empower them to do great job for others? I love that idea that you guys came up with earlier of having folks who have been beneficiaries in some ways of our crisis response system to help workshop in improving it, and then assisting others that are around them who may have a similar life experience to get them through it. That's the stuff that's inspiring and that really is energizing. And you could have all the theoretical conversations that you want to have in the history of the world. It does not help for us to talk about streamlining admissions and lowering barriers. What helps is, where are the barriers and what are we doing to lower them? Because it could be the difference between someone taking 3 to 6 months to get housed and someone taking 2 to 3 months to get housed. And that is a huge difference in someone's life. So thank you for thinking through those options and for being creative in that way. Keep it up, and please let me know how else I can help. Have a beautiful day. I hope you had a wonderful holiday weekend, and I will talk to you again soon. And Allison will be providing you these resources. Thank you to Allison for organizing this series, and hopefully we'll be back again with another series at some point, but feel free to use this as a reference and follow up in any way that you see fit. All right, thanks everybody. We'll talk to you soon.